Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure for me to rise and debate on Bill C-71. Particularly, I feel myself I'm lucky because the government once again is limiting debate on matters before Parliament, something that the Deputy House Leader of the Liberal Party suggested they would never do when they were in opposition, Mr. Speaker. But now we're well over 24 opportunities for time allocation, omnibus legislation, particularly implementing budgets, something he called an assault on democracy in the past, Mr. Speaker. So what I find so interesting is the hashtag used by Liberal MPs during the election was real change. And what we see is a real change from what they promised. You know, a lot of them in ridings like Peterborough, Northumberland, Peterborough South, Bay of Quinte, Prince Edward Hastings, Kenora, Glengarry, Prescott Russell, our previous speaker, I know have told their constituents that they opposed the previous Liberal majority government's targeting of law-abiding gun owners in the form of a long gun registry, premised upon fighting crime, but fighting crime by attacking the rights of law-abiding citizens, many of whom are amongst the most law-abiding citizens in the country, and statistics can prove that, Mr. Speaker, because to possess the right to have a firearm, there's responsibilities that come with it. So these are already amongst the most law-abiding citizens, or they do not get that right. I should add I'm going to divide my time with the capable MP from Lakeland, Mr. Speaker. And once again, we have the same approach. So all those MPs now quite worried about keeping their promises to their constituents, they're quite worried because they see the same approach the Liberal government under Jean Chrétien and Alan Rock took to firearms regulation, Mr. Speaker. We saw the Minister of Public Safety and his Parliamentary Secretary and a number of other MPs host a summit on guns and gangs, Mr. Speaker. They made a lot of news about that. But in C-71, there is nothing to tackle gang-related crime, Mr. Speaker. There's nothing in here to tackle the illegally smuggled weapons from at the U.S. border. We actually, in the Conservative government, armed the CBSA and gave them additional resources to make sure that illegal weapons could be caught coming into the country, which is the problem. So not only do we not have that, there's no reference in this bill to tackling or increasing penalties for use of guns in violent crime, gang-related organized crime. None of that's there. What the Liberals, just like Chrétien and Alan Rock, they talk about the need for legislation because of crime, and then they go after law-abiding sport shooters, hunters, hunters in rural Canada from Aboriginal communities, Mr. Speaker. This is the people that actually have to suffer the consequences of this Bill C-71 and the backdoor registry that I'll speak about in a moment. Even on the weekend, hearing the Minister of Public Safety try to avoid or evade questions from CBC Radio on the House, and I invite people to listen to that. They use a 5-year period when talking about gun violence. And they did that because 2013 was the lowest year, I think, in modern records for violent crime involving guns in Canada. So they used that as a starting point to try and show dramatic increases in crime, Mr. Speaker. But then seconds later, the minister had to acknowledge they only use a 1 to 2 year time frame to suggest that this bill is needed because guns are coming from robberies in rural areas or robberies from stores, so that they're saying the problem is domestic. They're saying the problem is not the illegal smuggling of weapons from the United States, which I would suggest to this House is the problem for guns and organized crime, Mr. Speaker. They're not using a possession and acquisition license when they're running guns from the United States. So the minister uses a 1 to 2 year timeline to suggest there's a real problem with thefts of firearms from stores and rural properties, Mr. Speaker. What is terribly ironic in that is for 2 years, members of the Conservative caucus have been demanding a response from the government with respect to rural crime, because we've seen a large increase. Not only has there been no response, no additional RCMP resources, no strategy, what we see now is they're blaming crime rates in rural Canada and using it as a justification to bring in a backdoor gun registry, Mr. Speaker. So if they're trying to not cherry-pick statistics, why a 5-year window for gun violence statistics as a justification for C-71 and a 1 to 2 year window to suggest the problem is domestic-based, Mr. Speaker? The CBC caught him in that conundrum, and he tried his best to avoid it. We're also seeing a change allowing final control to go from government and cabinet to bureaucrats, Mr. Speaker. I have utmost respect for the RCMP and all its specialized units within it, Mr. Speaker, but as a veteran, as a lawyer, as a parliamentarian, I'm very much of the view that Parliament creates the laws and the RCMP enforce the laws. They do not write the laws, Mr. Speaker. And the government has grandfathered in this bill a number of firearms that it's reclassifying. Why did they do that, Mr. Speaker? Because they're admitting that reclassifications are unfair. I would like to see a change to this bill that makes grandfathering permanent going forward. So if there's ever a reclassification, people affected and their property rights are grandfathered. They seem to admit the grandfathering is required here. Why not make it prospective going forward? Because here's why. Law-abiding owners who follow all the rules and regulations with respect to their firearm are suddenly, because of one meeting of some bureaucrats, declared criminals or in possession of an illegal weapon, Mr. Speaker, when they've owned and used that for sport shooting or hunting, fined for many years. So suddenly, with one blanket move, dozens, hundreds, or thousands of people, what they already possess is somehow deemed illegal. If they're going to grandfather in this bill, they should grandfather going forward, Mr. Speaker. I would like to see that, because the very fact they use grandfathering is an admission that the reclassifications we've seen in previous years have been unfair to people who've been following the rules and are law-abiding, Mr. Speaker. And then this suggestion by the Liberal government that this is not a backdoor registry is laughable, Mr. Speaker. And I'm going to say, I mentioned a number of ridings before, they're going to have to go in their ridings and say how this isn't a stealth attack to bring back the registry. As I said yesterday, or I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, yesterday in the House, the Minister of Public Safety suggested to this House, I'll quote, "All they're asking for now is for store owners to keep records of who bought the gun and under what PAL, the possession acquisition license," end quote, Mr. Speaker. Well, that's incomplete, Mr. Speaker. That's actually not accurate. What Bill C-71 says, and I'm quoting from section 58.11b, Mr. Speaker, the business must record and keep for a period of time the make, model, type, serial number, in addition to the two elements that that the Public Safety Minister suggested, Mr. Speaker. On top of that, the use of the term registrar, the data, all of this is a backdoor way. And the problem here, Mr. Speaker, as the member from Kenora, another riding where people are going to be asking him questions, the Conservative government of Brian Mulroney brought in background checks. We agree with background checks. We brought them in. And enhancing those are fine, Mr. Speaker. But once again, when you premise your legislation on tackling guns and gangs, and we look at the legislation, there is zero on illegal weapons smuggled from the United States, zero on organized crime, zero on gangs. And once again, a total focus on the registration, the recording, the auditing of people who are following the rules. The people that use these in rural Canada, hunters, farmers, First Nations. Yet they set up the argument once again as we got to tackle urban crime And once again, it's a backdoor attempt to regulate and reclassify law-abiding users. To have a PAL, Mr. Speaker, you have to be law-abiding. These are some of our most law-abiding citizens. So I wish the Liberals would stop this pitting of rural Canada versus urban Canada. Be straight with all Canadians.